All right, on behalf of the Schmid Law Library, welcome to the kickoff of the 2013-2014 S.T.I.R Talk season. For those of you S.T.I.R rookies, S.T.I.R stands for Share, Think, Inspire, and most importantly, Relax. Hopefully you've all done a good job of relaxing. It looks like you're doing a good job so far. Basically the talks are a chance for you all to get a chance to know what your professors are doing outside of their classroom. I'm pleased to introduce our first S.T.I.R presenter of the new season, Professor Brian Lepard. Professor Lepard joined our law faculty in 1995 after several years practicing tax law with a firm in Philadelphia. He teaches a diverse array of classes ranging from international human rights law to business transactions and business planning. Much of his research and outreach focus on international law topics. Professor Lepard received his BA from Princeton and received his JD from Yale Law School, where he was editor of the Yale Journal of International Law. In his S.T.I.R talk today, Professor Lepard will discuss an issue straight from current events. Humanitarian intervention in Syria, is it legal international law? Drawing from his book, Rethinking Humanitarian Intervention. Please join me in welcoming Professor Brian Lepard.
Well, as my students can tell you, I am not exactly known for being brief. So I enlisted one of them who eagerly volunteered, Titus here, to be the official gong ringer, but I understand the whole point is to avoid the gong. All right, so I'm going to do my very best here. As Matt mentioned, I'm going to be talking about a very topical topic, which is, would U.S. intervention in Syria be lawful under international law? Now this, of course, looked like it was going to be imminent just a few weeks ago. Then suddenly there were some developments which seemed to have delayed this, and that has made many people quite happy. But apparently at any time, the U.S. still says it reserves the right to commence military strikes. And so we'll be looking at whether this would be lawful under international law. Of course, like a good professor, I'm going to offer a lot more questions than answers, but I will be sharing with you towards the end just a few thoughts of my own based on my research. So, to begin, let's talk about what happened last month. In August, there was a terrible chemical weapons attack. Over 1,400 civilians were killed. Of those, at least 426 were children, according to a U.S. report. And in fact, just this past Monday, September 16th, a UN investigating team released its own report that confirmed that sarin gas was indeed used. Of course, it didn't officially say it was by the Syrian government, but everyone who is an expert in this field realizes that that, in fact, was the implication of the UN's own findings. Now, let's just take a little bit of a tour historically of the international norm that has really arisen prohibiting and banning these terrible weapons. So we actually have to go back to World War I, where both the Germans and the Allies used mustard gas. Almost 100,000 troops on all sides were killed. Really, the world was horribly repelled by the great horror that these weapons inflicted on people. And so, they decided to ban them. In Geneva, Switzerland, a treaty was adopted, the Gas Protocol of 1925, which banned the use of chemical weapons, poison gas weapons, and Syria actually did ratify this treaty. Now, let's fast forward a bit to World War II. Of course, the horrors of Auschwitz and the Holocaust, it became apparent certainly towards the end of the war. World leaders resolved that they would never let this happen again, that they needed to create a new organization to stop this kind of gross human rights violation, but they also, of course, wanted to stop aggressive war. And so they adopted, in San Francisco, California, the United Nations Charter. That was in June 1945. And among other purposes, though, the Charter proclaims that it is created to promote universal respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, without discrimination. So human rights figure prominently as a purpose of the UN. And in fact, every single member of the UN undertakes, in Article 56, to protect human rights, at least cooperate with the UN in promoting human rights. However, as I mentioned, the UN Charter also was created to put an end to aggressive war, and therefore it prohibits states from using force unless the UN Security Council has authorized it, or unless the state is acting in individual or collective self-defense. So let's just take a closer look at those rules. Article 2, paragraph 4 specifically says, all UN member states must refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any other state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the UN's purposes. On the other hand, Chapter 7 of the Charter gives the Security Council very wide-ranging powers to, in fact, use force or authorize member states to use force if it finds there has been a threat to the peace, a breach of the peace, or an act of aggression. The problem, of course, is that under UN Security Council voting rules, none of the 5 permanent members, namely the US, Russia, China, France, and the UK, must veto the action. If any one of them vetoes, then the resolution cannot pass. And we'll get to why that's been a problem with Syria shortly. In addition, Article 51 of the Charter proclaims that nothing in it shall prohibit the use of individual or collective self-defense against an armed attack against a member state, at least until the Security Council has acted. So this is a fundamental right under customary international law. Now let's fast forward. 1948, the UN adopts the Genocide Convention. This is a treaty under which states proclaim that genocide is a crime under international law and under which they undertake to prevent and to punish it. Now, it only took the US 40 years to get around to ratifying it, but thank goodness we eventually did in 1988. Dragged our feet just a little bit on that one. Also, basically the very next day after that treaty was adopted by the General Assembly adopted the text of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which proclaims that every human being has fundamental rights that cannot be violated, including the right to life and the right not to be tortured. On the other hand, the Declaration is not a legally binding treaty. It is only formally a recommendation to member states. So those are some basic documents in the human rights area. Now, we come to the Chemical Weapons Convention of 1993, which was adopted in Paris, France. This bans the use of chemical weapons by states parties. It builds on the Geneva Gas Protocol. The US did ratify this treaty fairly quickly, 1997. Syria, however, was one of only a few states, and you can see them in red on that little map, that had not ratified it, at least until last Saturday. Yes, last Saturday, September 14th, as part of all of this diplomatic enterprise and all these talks that have gone on, Syria did accede to the convention, and the treaty will enter into force for Syria next October. On the other hand, the treaty does not specifically say that it has any specific enforcement mechanisms. Now, let's look at another trend. That is a trend towards recognizing a possible right of humanitarian intervention when mass atrocities occur. In 1994, as you may know, there was a genocide in Rwanda. Over 800,000 Tutsi were killed. The sad fact is, even though the UN had troops there, the US and other countries, instead of reinforcing them, withdrew them. Right? All these people were slaughtered. President Clinton later visited Rwanda, and he apologized to the people of Rwanda for having failed them. Well, world leaders resolved they weren't going to make the same mistake. And in 1999, when it appeared that there could be a massacre of ethnic Albanians in Kosovo, the US and its NATO allies said, we're not going to let this happen again, and they commenced a bombing campaign against Serbia with the intention of inducing it to cease oppression of the ethnic Albanians. Unfortunately, they acted without Security Council approval because Russia and China, who wielded the veto, said they would not approve. This led to a very vivid and acrimonious debate on whether so-called humanitarian intervention could be permissible without Security Council authorization. Now, the UN also, in 2005, blessed an idea that was developed in the aftermath of these interventions called the responsibility to protect. And it said that when a state, which has the primary responsibility to protect its population, fails to do so, then the global community, acting through the Security Council, may in fact intervene. And indeed, in 2011, in Libya, we saw a possible example of this doctrine being put into operation. When the Security Council decided that Colonel Gaddafi was in fact slaughtering his own people, it authorized member states to take military action to protect civilians. The US and its allies participated in a bombing campaign. and some view this as implementation of responsibility to protect. So, what can we conclude legally from this brief review? First, of course, if the Security Council does bless some kind of military operation, and it well might, right now there are negotiations going on in the Council about a voluntary disarmament plan. Nevertheless, if it's blessed by the Council, it would seem that that would be lawful, thanks to its Chapter 7 powers. The big question everyone's reflecting on is, could the U.S. go ahead and act unilaterally without Security Council authorization? Well, let's look at a few key points of international law. Now, for those of you who are novices in international law, which certainly not the two L's, right? We had international perspectives last year, but soon all of you will have known the basics, thanks to that course. Basically, there are three main sources of international law: treaties, which are like contracts; customary international law, which is practices that states accept as law; and finally, what we might call general principles of law, principles that are found in all the world's legal systems. So with that in mind, let's think about some basic points. Point number one, the U.S. is a party to the UN Charter. That's a treaty. It says the U.S. can't use force, except in self-defense or without Security Council authorization. Pretty clear, it would seem. It would seem. So, and self-defense can only be triggered if there is, in fact, an armed attack against the U.S. or one of its allies. But, here's an interesting question, looking at the text of the Charter. Would an attack aimed at punishing a heinous act that the world has condemned through these treaties, the Gas Protocol, the Chemical Weapons Convention, would that actually be aimed at affecting the territorial integrity or political independence of Syria? And would it be contrary to the purposes of the UN? Might we argue, in fact, that this would be furthering the purpose of promoting human rights and not aimed at, say, breaking apart Syria territorially, not occupying it, and not affecting its political independence? Interesting question about the language, and some scholars have argued that Article 2.4 can be interpreted in this more nuanced way. Is any of this affected by the fact that, frankly, Syria wasn't even bound by the Chemical Weapons Convention until Saturday, maybe? Okay, or at least next month? Not clear. Are these norms part of customary law? Not clear. Does it matter that Russia has threatened a veto in the Security Council? In fact, that's what brought us to the current juncture where negotiations are at the forefront. What if Russia continues to veto any strong action? Might there be an evolving customary rule of law that says that when the Security Council can't act because of a veto, then countries like the U.S. may be able to step in? So interesting questions about whether the Kosovo intervention might be a kind of precedent for an evolving customary norm that would permit intervention under these circumstances. Similarly, does the responsibility to protect concept perhaps represent a general principle of law that's now being accepted that we ought to use to inform our interpretation of the UN Charter? Could there be a new norm of customary law reflected by the responsibility to protect? Most scholars say no, not yet, but these are very interesting questions raised by current events. And also, of course, does the Genocide Convention actually require the U.S. as a party to step in to prevent what might be a future or impending act of genocide by the Syrian government? And then, of course, the U.S. could always try to rely on self-defense as a rationale. There have already been intimations of this by the President. But again, the Charter is pretty clear. There has to be an armed attack in order for you to invoke self-defense, either against you, meaning the United States, or one of its allies. And so far, there has been no armed attack on other countries in the region. So these are very difficult questions to answer, but I have all the answers in this 500-page book. So just joking, which is available for sale. I'm only joking, of course. So now I have, what, 1 minute to summarize my 500-page book? 3 minutes. Okay, maybe we can handle that. All right, well, let me just suggest to you some ways of approaching these questions. And essentially, I developed an approach to looking at problems of humanitarian intervention that draws on ethical principles in international law itself, including the Charter and the Universal Declaration, and that are linked with a foundational principle of what I call unity in diversity, the concept that morally everyone ought to be unified with every other human being on the planet, while respecting his or her diversity, diversity of opinion, diversity of sex, race, religion, language, etc. And this then is an organizing principle. We find it in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and many other principles flow from that, I argue. I also try to show that these principles find support in the world's major religions, and I demonstrate that through various passages. So what are some relevant ethical principles here? Well, one, of course, is respect for law and treaties and the UN Charter. That's important, right? Another is, however, if the human race is unified, what we might call a duty of rescue, right? We have an ethical duty, often called a Good Samaritan duty, to come to the rescue of those who are threatened with death, right? Or with other mass human rights violations. Also, there's an ethical principle of open-minded consultation, solving problems consultatively. So, I mean, how do we work with all of these? I've got 1 minute to go. Okay, very difficult question. In sum, I believe that those principles support the scheme the Charter developed, which was designed to regulate the use of force. So lawfully, we do need to go through procedures of the Security Council. On the other hand, I do leave the door open. If the U.S. or other countries pursue every possible measure they can as required by the UN Charter to get Security Council authorization, but there is an imminent humanitarian disaster or atrocity on the horizon, query whether that's actually the case here, okay, then it may be ethical to go ahead and intervene, but solely for the purpose of putting an end to the risk faced by those potential victims of this mass atrocity. It may not be legal under international law, but it might be ethical. So I will conclude there. Did I avoid my gong? Just barely. Okay. What